welcome to the Active Travel Adventures podcast. I'm your host, Kit Parks. Today we're going to review my 12-point system I designed after making a very expensive mistake with a tour company. If you are a listener of the Adventure Travel Show podcast, my companion podcast, you've actually already heard this episode as I released it last week on that show. But this audience for the Active Travel Adventures podcast is larger, and also I think this subject matter is so important because it is a very expensive part of our travels, and so I want to make sure as many people as possible learn from the mistakes that I made and the system that I've devised to make sure I do not repeat that boo-boo. So without further ado, let's get started. I totally blew it this time, and I don't want you to make the same mistake I did. It was expensive. I spent several $1,000s on a tour where I felt trapped and miserable. So what went wrong? Let me count the ways, but also let me start at the beginning. A few years ago, I heard a very nice woman, an American woman, who lived in Egypt at the time and had a tour company that hired only local women guides to showcase the Middle East. Her dream was to share this amazing region with others. I was so inspired by the interview that I actually wrote to her to say that while I had zero interest in visiting the Middle East, if I ever changed my mind, I would go with her. This put me on her mailing list. Fast forward 18 months ago, I get an email from her announcing a new tour to Jordan, to Petra. Now my interest has peaked, and as I'm looking through it, I see it's a hiking trip being guided by the very first Mideastern women to summit the 7 summits. This woman is a badass, and I want to meet her. In my regular life, I'm unlikely to meet anyone who's ever climbed the tallest mountains on any of the continents. And for this woman to not only do it, but also to come from a region where women are sometimes considered chattel or second class, she must be amazing and strong. And so without any further consideration, I push the buy button. I'm going. I'm excited. I'm a little nervous about this big, scary Middle East part, but I'm excited nonetheless. Then I check the airfares. Ouch, it's really expensive. Especially coming from my Podunk area of North Carolina, where it's so time-consuming and expensive just to get out of this region. So I make a big, bold plan. I am going to bang out the Middle East in one fell swoop, one trip. I have interest in visiting not just Jordan, which my friend and travel blogger Sherry Ott from Ott's World tells me is the friendliest place on earth, but also Israel, which many friends have loved, and mysterious Morocco, which I've heard wonderful things about, and I always was interested in the Sahara. And yes, I realize Morocco is not the Middle East, but mentally I lump it together because it is an Arab nation. A lady I met on a plane once told me, and she was a very well-traveled lady, she tells me that Egypt was her very favorite country. What's not to like about sphinxes and pyramids? So I add that to the list. 4 countries, wow. But I'm going to do it, and I'm going to do it all in one fell swoop. And as long as I'm going to go with this Jordan hiking company, with this lady, I sign up for her other trips to Egypt and Morocco. I do no comparison shopping. Red flag number one. And I frankly only give a passing glance to the itineraries to the other countries, seeing that, there's a little bit of hiking in there, and we're doing some camping and camels, so I figure it's going to be pretty good. If the Jordan thing's all hiking, this should be fine. Well, red flag number 2. I'm remembering her podcast interview when I was so entranced with her passion and her desire to show everything off that I was like, I'm sure it's going to be great. The only reviews I read are those that I see on her website. I know no one who's ever been with this company. Red flag number 3. And like everybody else, I'm spinning plates, just trying to get things done. I was like, I'm sure it's fine. It's fine. So I just book them. The lady doesn't do a tour in Israel, and I felt pretty safe going there myself. So I just decided to do that trip solo, and hopefully when I get there or ahead of time, I'll arrange some self-guided tours. I'd like to do some hiking. So push. I'm buying all the buy buttons. I have now booked 3 epic tours. And I'm booking one-way airfares because I got to get carted all around the Middle East. I don't want to be going back and forth. Again, I just push all my chips on the table. I'm going to go in. I'm going all in. And the tour dates don't necessarily line up one right after another. So I have free time in between, which I kind of like because I'll be able to explore a little bit. But again, I've arranged this whole trip based on the itinerary of the 3 tours that were available, which left me in Israel for 19 days, which is longer than I would have liked to. But I was like, what the heck? I heard Israel is nice. I'll figure out something to do. Around the same time, right before this Middle Eastern adventure, I have 2 conferences and a rafting trip out in Idaho. So I decided, what the heck? I'm going to make this one bodacious, continuous trip. One-way flights all around. Remember, I lose 4 days of travel for every trip that I take just because of my location where I live here in the States. If I were to do these trips separately, I would lose 28 days just in travel. But by doing it in one fell swoop, it's only going to take me 9. So I figured that's a huge savings of my time. But I'm now going to be gone 3 months. Wow. Using the tips and tricks I taught you in the How to Get Cheap Flights episode on Adventure Travel Show podcast, I booked my flights. I'll put a link to that show in the show notes. I see that my flight from Orlando to Boise is going to stop in Minneapolis anywhere. I was like, never been to Minneapolis, never been to Minnesota. So I've got a couple days before my trip. I could either do it in Orlando, which I've been to many times, or I can spend some time in Minneapolis. Hit the buy button. I'm off to Minneapolis, spend a few days there. Great city, by the way. Really enjoyed it. I've never been to Boise either. So I flanked that trip, the rafting trip, with some exploration time before and after there. I absolutely fall in love with Boise. That's now one of my favorite cities. And then I'm going to have time from the rafting trip before I have to go to my conference in Billings, Montana, a travel conference. And I've got Els, my girlfriend that you met from Bhutan and also in the Glacier National Park episodes. She lives in Montana. So I was like, shoot, I'll go visit Els. And also I had heard from my sister, whose husband was a Delta pilot, and all the pilots love Missoula. I was like, go to Missoula. Go to Bozeman. So I am just building this massive trip. Bang, 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 bang. Hit the buy buttons again. I am making a serious dent in my travel savings account, but this is going to be worth it. This is epic. I can't wait, even though this is by far going to be the most expensive trip I've ever taken in my life. And in fact, I'm going to explain in a future episode how I can't afford to do all these trips. I've got some tips on that, but I'll leave that for a future episode. I'll put that on the itinerary to come up sometime a little bit later this spring. But for now, let me just say that this trip is going to be comprised of 1 month in the U.S., going from North Carolina to Florida, out west, and then from Billings for my conference there, then I head to the Middle East. And I'll be in the Middle East a little over 2 months. And when I travel, I like to actually enjoy the travel. Unlike a lot, I don't want to say bad about travel blogs, but a lot of them spend their time getting the right shot and doing the right blog posts and all that. I want to actually be in the moment of my travels, and I write about it when I get back. So this means for me not to have to do work either on the podcast or my paying job as a rental manager, I've got to get 6 months worth of work done in 3 months so I can go and really just relax on this trip. I'm not sure how I'm going to pull it off, but I'm determined to do it. My 1 month U.S. portion of this colossal trip was fabulous, enlightening, and fulfilling. Once I headed east for the rest of my trip, there was some that was great and some that was not so much. I made a ton of silly boo-boos, and I don't want you to make those same mistakes. In the past, I've been super lucky with the tour companies I've gone with, but I've also had personal references that guided me to those tour companies. But I learned on this trip that tour companies have personalities, and it's really important that you match your personality to the tour company's personality for you to have a happy experience. So when I got back, I did a ton of research to find out what are all the different things I should be looking at in order to choose the right tour company for me. And I put together a system so I don't make that same expensive mistake again. And that's what I want to share with you today, because I don't want you to make the same expensive mistakes that I did. Okay, so let's cross the pond. I've got to get to Casablanca, Morocco, and then from there, take a train to Marrakesh to meet up with my tour group. I'd never been to a Muslim country before, and frankly, I was a little bit twitchy about it, as I think many people would be if you read the press these days. I wasn't quite sure what to expect when I got to Morocco, and I read online that I was going to have to take a female-only car on my train ride from Casablanca to Marrakesh, and I wasn't sure if I had to wear a headscarf. But I bought a hijab just to be on the safe side and was prepared. I figured I was going to follow suit with whatever the local women were doing. If they were wearing headwear, I'd wear it. If they didn't, I wouldn't. When I arrived in Casablanca, I splurged and paid an extra $2 for the first-class train ticket. But it turns out I was the only one in the car, so I still wasn't really sure about the headgear, but it seemed more casual than I was expecting, and so I had the scarf around my shoulders, and I just kind of left it that way. I looked ridiculous in the hijab anyway. At some point, I had to change trains, and I was a bit confused with my ticket, and somebody I've showed my ticket to said that I had an assigned seat for this next train, and they pointed me to a car a little bit further up the track. I look at my compartment. There's this glass window front, and then inside is two little booths, and there's 4 men sitting in there, all sound asleep. And I'm like, well, I thought it was supposed to be in a female-only car. But that man that I asked seemed insistent that this was the car I was supposed to go in. So I said, whatever. So I sit in the car. Again, I just kind of go around. I try not to wake anybody up. And I just sit there with my suitcase. And eventually the conductor comes by, looks at me, looks at my ticket, never says anything. So I figure everything's all right. Every once in a while, one of the men would wake up, eyes would open, they'd see me, no surprised look, no horrified look. So I said, okay, I must have done something all right. Nobody seems to be concerned one way or another about me. And eventually I make it to Marrakesh. Okay, that's pretty easy. I even took a nap on the train. I arrive in Marrakesh and my Airbnb host is kind enough to send a driver to meet me. I'm going to be staying at the Medina, but you can't fit a car there. So he talks to my driver and arranges a meetup point where he collects me and then walks me through this charming maze of streets and alleys before we finally get to my place. But I tell him before I get there, I said, I'm starving. I haven't eaten in forever and I need some food. And so he takes me to a restaurant. And again, there's no women sitting in the restaurant. I have no idea what the protocol is in this country. I'm still like a little bit twitchy about what's going on. My host seems perfectly fine with everything. I order a sandwich to go and off I go. And when I get to my apartment, I love it. It looks Moroccan. It's all red upholstery and it's got the little bronze lanterns. And I was like, ooh, I am definitely in Marrakesh. This is perfect. A great way to start my trip. And the next morning, I'm to meet Peg in person. Peg is an Active Travel Adventures listener, and we had connected because of the podcast and found out she was also interested in going to Morocco. So we ended up being roommates, saved us a little bit. Neither one of us had to pay the single supplement, and we got a chance to hang out with somebody that we already knew we were going to like each other. We talked on the phone and emails and all that, so that was pretty cool. And she had gotten there a day or two before I did and arranged for us to take a cooking class, which we had a marvelous time. And then the next day, we started our tour with the lady I'd originally heard on the podcast interview that I booked the 3 total tours with. Day 1 of our tour went really well, but as the tour progressed, I realized that this trip was nothing like the Jordan tour I'd signed up for. Even my cursory glance at the itinerary beforehand, I saw that it wasn't going to be as active as the Jordan by any stretch of the imagination, but I did see that we did have a day of hiking. We were going to go on a camel safari, etc. So I was like, well, it's going to be more cultural than adventure, but so it'll be like a level 2 or so I thought. It wasn't long before I realized I was on one of those dreaded get on the bus, get out, take a picture, get back on the bus kinds of tours. I about died. My brain was having difficulty processing the fact that the hiking Jordan trip was so radically different than the Moroccan trip. It was almost like split personalities for a tour company, and I came to realize later that I think they just haven't decided who they're appealing to, and so they're throwing out tours with all different audiences instead of trying to just grab onto the one that fits the personality of their company. They're just trying to find their way still. Again, that's just my opinion. To me, they're trying to be all things to all people instead of finding their niche. The target audience for the Jordan trip is so radically different than the target audience for the Moroccan trip. Night and day different. I'm not saying one's good and one's bad. It's just one's good and one's bad for me. So I've discovered it's super critical to match your personality and your expectations with the right tour. That was a huge, huge boo-boo on my part. So that's my red flag number 3. I chose a tour company that is still relatively new and still trying to figure out who they are and who is their audience. And then guess what happens? A couple days into the tour, we find out that she's canceled the hiking day, and so we will now instead have a free day. Apparently, she realized on her spring hiking trip in Jordan that was pretty intense hiking that maybe she shouldn't be doing hiking after all. So she cancels the hiking day on this trip that I've already paid for. So I end up hiring my own private guide to take me and drive me out to the mountains to do hiking in the mountains. Like I said, she's still trying to figure out who is she catering to. So I wasn't very happy about that change of plans, but I'm getting a little ahead of myself. On one of the early days, we spent over 9 hours sitting in the van. And I told her that's way too long for her to be having guests in vans. And we would get out for a pit stop and coffee. Sometimes we'd stop at a shop where the guides get a commission. But I realized I had just really made a really serious mistake on choosing this company. We were also being nickel-dined on tipping museum guides. And I'm talking like 50 cents or $1 she's telling us to tip at the end of whatever the activity was. But for Pete's sake, when you're spending $4,000, the whole total of all these extra tips, we're not even talking $20 over the course of the whole tour. So not only was I feeling like she was being cheap, but we always had to have all the small change with us, which is a nuisance. On tours, I expect to tip the main guide and the drivers. But I liked how they did it on my Jordan trip, where we had multiple different drivers because we would stop and start depending on if we were camping or going in country or whatnot. And so at the beginning of the tour, we were given an estimate of what the tips should be for the various drivers, and we pooled our money there, gave it to one of the guys. It was his job to tip on all of our behalfs, and it just made things so much simpler. I wish she had done that if she didn't want to add that extra $20 to the cost of our trip. I also felt how she handled the water, the drinking water, was fairly petty as well. I mean, if you go on a trip with my affiliate Active Adventures, the bus is always filled with drinks and snacks and whatever you need to be comfortable. On this trip in a country where you cannot drink the water, but the water is cheap, or bottled water is cheap, we're talking like 50 cents or so for a liter and a half of water, that, again, we're always looking for change to go get the water. Instead of just having a cooler there, what is it going to cost us? Add another $20 to the cost of the trip and have the drinks provided. It just seemed like a simpler solution to me, and certainly more client-friendly. Those things just bugged me because I found them petty. But what I found really deceitful was that most of the lunches were not included in the tour, yet we had no choice as to where we were eating or even what we ate. I think she was just trying to hit a price point in her advertising. But in her defense, a lot of the things were right with the tour company as well. We had an outstanding female guide, Chama, who I will remember the rest of my life. She was vibrant, knowledgeable, fun, and really enhanced the trip overall. They also made sure that the vans that we were in were very safe and comfortable, and the driver in particular was very safe, which in that region is super important because the driving is absolute craziness. They have lines in the road, but they are just as a use of paint because nobody pays any attention to the lines in the roads. And so you want a driver that's going to be conscientious. So double kudos for them for making sure that we were in a safe environment, a good van, and with a great guide. So if this was the kind of tour that I was looking for, this would have been a good company to do so. It just was not what I was expecting at all. That was the big problem. I liked the little boutique inns that we stayed in for the most part, and we got to see the highlights of the country. But I think the biggest mistake that she made was in failing to manage her guests' expectations. When I got home again, I was like, I do not want to repeat that boo-boo again. So what was I missing? And so I compared her tour to some of the others. A lot of them were going to the same destinations and were just as bus heavy. But they managed their guests' expectations by saying you were going to be in the vehicle a lot. But you see no mention of the bus time in the brochures on the particular tour that I took. And because by looking at the itinerary, it appeared that the middle of the day we were going to be free to find our own place to go to lunch, and I incorrectly assumed that we were going to be wherever we were going to be for the day and out exploring on our own. I just thought there's going to be a lot more autonomy to this trip. So again, and that to me is what lunch on my own means, is that I'm someplace where I can go choose the lunch. I did not realize we would be driving all day, stopped at a pre-selected restaurant as a group, get off, eat as a group, generally speaking, all but one time, the exact same meal, and then get back on the bus to continue driving. I did not ask enough questions. I didn't ask any questions. I think I just got careless because I'd had such extraordinarily, apparently, good luck in going with great compatible companies in the past. It never crossed my mind that this would be, because I was so impressed with her and her goals and her mission when I heard her on that podcast. It just never crossed my mind to do just a little bit more investigation before I hit that buy button. Again, I did not do my homework, and when I get finished with this little saga, I'm going to go through the 12 things you need to make sure you check on before you book a tour to make sure you don't make the same expensive mistake that I did. Granted, I'm doubly at fault for not clearly studying the itinerary and looking for the white spaces. Look for what was not being said. I should have checked the country Morocco against a scaled map. I had no idea how big the country was. It's 10% larger than California, and we tried to see the whole country in less than 2 weeks. That's my bad. That is a recipe for sitting on a van. In hindsight, I wish we'd done half as much touring, but explored more deeply, more slowly when we got there. Slow travel is my preferred method these days, and this Moroccan trip was definitely not slow travel. I came so close to bailing. Peg, God bless her, had studied the itinerary. Good for you, Peg. You did your homework. So she was more mentally prepared than I was for this to be more of the snap and get on the van kind of a tour. So I guess the bottom line is that I loved the country of Morocco, but I definitely did not mesh with the tour company. They were really nice, so it wasn't that. And I felt they were overambitious in what they were trying to show their guests. And I also felt like I was being nickeled and dimed, which I didn't like. One really nice thing they did do was at the beginning, they gave us a roll of small coins for the pay toilets. In Morocco, you always have to pay for the toilet. And it's in small little coins that I never got as change. So that was at least solved one major problem. And there's one last thing before I get on. This is the kicker. I'm getting ready to leave for my trip. I'm still in the U.S., getting ready to go on the first leg in the 1 month U.S. And I get an email that my tours to both Jordan, remember this is the tour that started this whole big adventure, and Egypt have been canceled because they didn't have enough people. This is long after I bought my airline tickets. And I had travel insurance, so I could have gotten my cash back for the trips had I decided to cancel Egypt and Jordan. But shoot, I'm all the way over there. I had to scramble, but I was able to juggle the dates a little bit and find some other tours that had not been sold out. And I was having problems finding unsold out tours. Again, another problem with going a small, nondescript little company that most people don't know about. She couldn't get her tours filled up, yet I was having problems finding vacant spots in other tours at this late date. In fact, another ADA listener, Margaret, who you met on the Antarctica episode, mentioned afterwards that she was going to Petra, and so I ended up going on the same tour that she went on, except for a week later, and I had a ball. That was a good fit company. That turned out great. And for the Egypt trip, I knew that was going to be strictly cultural, and I was able to find a company that fit the bill for that I was satisfied with. I guess the bottom line is I got a bad taste in my mouth about my experience with this company, which I mainly blame on myself. And again, if you know what you're getting into and the company manages your expectations, you'd either be fine with it or don't book with them. I truly consider myself more to blame for my dissatisfaction than with them, except for the nickel and diming and I think a little bit of the falsifying about the lunch stuff. But like I said, I've had a lot of time to think about it. And you know me, I'm a researcher. So between my notes and my research, I've decided that this kind of expensive mistake will not happen again. So I put together a system to make sure you and I don't make the same expensive mistake. So here we go. These are the 12 questions that you need to have answered before you push that buy button, before you book your next tour. Number 1, we just want to kind of narrow down the field. There are thousands of tour companies out there, and particularly with adventure travel, more and more are popping up like mushrooms, and you got to be particularly careful because there's more of a safety issue involved with adventure tour companies. So you just want to kind of get like a brief overview of a tour company's itinerary. If you've already chosen your destination, find some that are going to there, and then look to see, are they going to at least the key things that you would like to see in that destination? For example, Margaret on the Jordan chose to go with a company called Explore because they were going to spend 2 days in Petra. Most companies only spend 1 day. So that was a very defining characteristic of the company that she chose. I've got some links I'm going to put in the show notes of companies that can help you fine-tune if you have no idea even where to start. There's 3 good companies that will tell you these are good for solo, or this is good for a specific destination, or if you want to make sure that a company carries some heavy insurance to make sure they're very safety conscious. In the show notes, I'm going to include 3 websites, TourRadar, Stride Travel, and TripWing, that can help you find tour companies to at least start your list. Because like I said, there's thousands of companies out there, and we've got to at least start winnowing down that list. So once you've narrowed down to at least a handful of companies that are possibilities, before you spend any more time investigating them, let's first find out if they're reputable. So here I'm going to recommend that you go to Trustpilot, Yelp, TripAdvisor, check out Facebook groups for the destination, and look at the travel company reviews. Now remember, if you see a 1-star, if people are upset, they're going to usually take the time to do the bad reviews. But read the bad reviews because it could be some ridiculous thing like, they couldn't speak English in the country I was going to. And you're going to a foreign country where that's not their native tongue. You can't expect everybody there to speak English. The taxi drivers couldn't speak English. They're not expected to. So see if the review is something ridiculous like that. As long as your main guide speaks English or your native language that you're going with, you're fine. But just like I said, you might see some ridiculous things. Or is it something that you should be paying attention to? In general, you want about 80% or more of the reviews to be 4 or 5 stars. If you start getting less than that, I'd probably cross them off the list. But I wouldn't let 1-star reviews here and there eliminate that company, because it could just be a disgruntled person or somebody that is totally unrealistic in their expectations. Like, I couldn't give that Moroccan tour company a 1 because I was disappointed, because I'm the one that should get the 1 star on that for not doing my homework. If I were looking for a get on the bus, get out and take a picture tour, they did great at that, outside of the fact that they conned us a little bit on the lunches where it was not really free time. They were just trying to camouflage the true price of the tour. Other than that, I'd give them probably a 3 to 3.5 stars. So once you've got a core group of tour companies to evaluate, now it's important to check out the details and the pace of the tour. Is there a good balance of activities? And if this is a heavy physical adventure, does the itinerary allow time for your body to rest in between activities? And are you capable of doing the activities mentioned? If it's something like a long distance hike or a bike ride, is there a support van in case you get injured or your body just needs a rest? Really check to make sure this trip meets your expectations and the tour operator has outlined those expectations for you. And really super important, remember Margaret and Petra. How much time are you actually going to be spending on the activities that most drew you to this destination in the first place? If you're an antiquities lover and you only get an hour at the main museum, is that going to be enough for you? Ask. The time to ask is before you book the buy button. You want to know, does the activity level match your fitness level and your expectations? You don't have to be at the fitness level to start with when you book it, but you have to be willing to train for it, both for your own enjoyment and also in fairness to the other people on your trip. I'll put a link to my podcast on training for your next adventure travel trip on the show notes for you. Even on the less adventurous trips, you need to match you and the tour as far as how much you're going to be standing and walking. And then you want to look at how intense is the itinerary? How much time are you actually going to be spending on the bus? And this you might have to ask, because it may not be laid out for you unless it's really heavy, like I saw in some of the competitive Moroccan tours. You want to know, what is the pace of the tour? And don't just try to read between the lines. Like I said, ask. Ask how much time are you actually spending traveling from one place to the other. And a really good indicator is how many times are you switching lodging. If when you're looking at the itinerary, you see a lot of one-night stands, that generally means you're spending a lot of time on the bus and spending a lot of time packing and unpacking, checking in and checking out. So keep that in mind. So for most trips, unless you're backpacking where you're going from one place to another, spending a couple nights in one place multiple times is preferred. If you're going at a dizzying pace, you're going to be able to check a lot of boxes that, yeah, you saw this, you saw that, but you're going to be frazzled. And for me, I find it a less satisfying experience. And do you want to come home invigorated or exhausted? The pace of a trip is really important. And most trips are going to have travel days. So another important thing to check on is, how is the tour company managing those travel days? In Morocco, we usually just had a pit stop to go to the restroom or a shop stop, even on the 9-hour drive days, of which there were many. We'd get out and take a picture and get back on the bus of a pretty scenic thing. But it was, some days, literally, it was all van and maybe total an hour of activity. But compare that with my active adventures trip to New Zealand, and even on a long travel day, which I think we had one in particular long day. But they made sure that every couple hours we got out and we hiked for a little bit and we saw something cool. So they made an adventure even out of our travel days. That was not my experience in Morocco. Big difference in the company styles. Number 4 is super important. Do you have a local guide? Ask them about who's going to be my guide. It doesn't have to be the specific name. You want to find out, is it an employee? Is it somebody that they just go to the pool of available guides that day? Some tour companies do that. Do they use licensed local guides? And does the guide speak the language that you understand? Do they speak the local language so they can communicate with the locals? Is the guide an employee or a subcontractor? A subcontractor doesn't mean it's a bad thing. You just want to understand what you're getting yourself into. Do they use the same people all the time, or do they get different people? Do they have a long-term relationship with the company? A passionate, knowledgeable local guide can make your trip. My guide in Beijing had the goal to become the curator of the Forbidden City. Without him, I never would have appreciated so many of the nuances he brought to life for me in a culture I found so completely alien. And you want to know, does the guide actually explain the things that you're experiencing, or does she simply plan the logistics and drop you off? It's pretty much what I had a bit in Egypt. The guide was very knowledgeable, but he would only spend maybe 15 minutes explaining something important, telling us about what we were about to see, and then he left us wandering for about an hour while he went off for coffee and a cigarette. Whereas the things that we were seeing in Egypt would be like the Beijing. I'd be totally clueless knowing what I was looking at. I really needed the guide to really hold my hand, to really show me some of the things that I was seeing so I could really appreciate them. And if you contrast that with Beijing, where literally that's what he did. He was with us the whole time. If we had free time, it was for things that it wasn't important that we understood what we were looking at. It was either taking a walk or doing something fun, climbing the Great Wall. He could tell us about that, then we climbed. He didn't need to hold our hand climbing the wall. But when we were in the Forbidden City or Tiananmen Square, he was with us the whole time, pointing out things to bring that area to life for us. Unfortunately, that's not what I got in Egypt. Like I said, he was good, but he wasn't there the whole time. I'd give him a A for knowledge, but a B minus for being there. So find out. And again, you want to make sure the guide can speak your language fluently, or else you're fluent in the language of the tour. Ask to or look to see, are you going to a lot of the little craft shops? If you're doing that, and I don't begrudge the guides this, they usually get a commission from the shop for bringing the tours to them. And I've bought things from them, but just because it's easier, and they generally are of better quality than sometimes you'll see in the markets. But if you're spending a lot of times going and being ushered to these shops, the guide may be more interested in getting his commissions for the sales than he is in showing you his culture. Plus, I don't like spending a whole lot of my time in the shops. I'd rather be out exploring and seeing the city or the countryside or wherever it is that I am. A good question to ask too is, what is the guide to guest ratio? On adventure travel trips, you want to have at least 2 guides, particularly if you have any group more than 6 or so, because if you're on a hike, you want somebody in the front and the back of the pack that knows where they're going, just for your safety and to accommodate people of different paces. And you want to ask too, on adventure trips, does the guide have special training in first aid? Kind of important. Number 5, does the tour company offer any special experiences, especially of the kind that would be very difficult for you to arrange on your own? This can include things like homestays or meals at a local's home. I had tea with cocoa in a Maasai hut in Tanzania. I had lunch in a hutang in Beijing. And I learned how to cook tagine in Morocco. I love being able to see how the people actually live and to go into somebody's home. But it's kind of difficult doing that on your own. Sometimes that's something a tour company can provide. You want to find out what kind of cultural immersion opportunities are available with the different tours that you're considering. Sometimes the company may have special access, like we did with Active Adventures in New Zealand. In 2 places we went to, one, a lodge was built specifically for them and their needs because they were such regular customers. And then in another, we were allowed to actually sleep at Milford Sound. Most people have to get up at 3 o'clock in the morning, get on a bus for 5 hours, go down, see the sound, get back on the bus and go back. We got to spend the night. That is a plus. And that's a special experience that only certain tour companies, in fact, I think they're probably the only ones down there that could do that. And that's because of their special relationship and being based in that country. They know the people. They've been doing business with them for years, if not decades. And they found some good companies, but now we're going to make sure it's the right company for you. So now we want to look at the group dynamics and the size and finding out, are these people your people? Are the other guests your people? And this is particularly important if you're traveling solo, because you want to make sure you're joining a group that matches your own demographics. I'm almost 60 years old. I do not want to travel with a bunch of 20-year-olds. I don't care how nice they are. I want to be around my people. I want to be with people that have had life experiences and not out to see how much they can drink that night. So how do you find out? One good clue is look at the photos on the tour company's websites. Who are they trying to attract? That's who's going to be in the photos. Another thing you can look at is how nice is the lodging. When there's options, if it's like down and dirty, you're probably with the 20-year-olds. But if you're in the city and you're in some little boutique inn, it's probably going to skew a little bit older. You can also check out the About and the FAQ sections of the tour company's website for clues. Look and you can find your people, and this makes for a much more satisfying trip that often ends up with some lifelong friendships. I also like to look at the size of the group. I personally prefer like 8 to 12 people. I find that small enough that you can fit into the little boutique inns and other cool little guest houses, nice restaurants, the small little restaurants, but it's large enough that I'm able to find several new friends. It's also small enough that you're not waiting forever at pit stops or checking in and checking out and all that kind of thing that can be a little bit cumbersome with a large group. A large busload of almost 50 people means just by nature you can only stay at the large hotels. You can only eat at the big restaurants where the bus is able to fit in the parking place. So forget staying at the cute little Medinas in Morocco. You're most likely going to be eating at touristy stops and touristy buffets for your meals if you go the big bus style. Then now let's look at the lodging. What kind of lodging are you going to be staying in? Like I mentioned, the lodging can give you a clue to who the average traveler is for this particular tour group, but not always. You might find situations that you may not have other options. Again, I'm going to go back to the New Zealand trip. When we were hiking the Angeles Circuit, there was only one option, the huts, the mountain huts. So we were in like a dorm-style cabin on top of a mountain. And that was great. I had no problem with that. But I can't judge the quality of the tour based on that because that was the only option. When there are options, that's where you can tell. Do they put you in the cute little boutique inns or put you in a yurt or something really interesting that makes it a really fun experience? Or are you going to a big box chain hotel? Are you in the heart of the historic district or are you out in the outskirts where A, the bus can fit, and B, it saves the tour company some money, but now you're spending time going back and forth to town every day? Remember, when you're traveling with a large bus, you're often going to stay where it's convenient for the bus to park, and that's also going to dictate the size of your accommodation, whether your tour is a luxury one or a cheap one. A big bus is almost always going to mean an impersonal hotel. And should you have any special needs, you got to find out whether you can comfortably stay in the places that they've selected. Do you need an elevator? A lot of places in the world don't have those. If the lodging works out, number 8, what's the plan for the meals? Which meals are included? And do these meals showcase the local flavors and dishes, or are you going to the touristy buffets? What kind of choices do you have of restaurants for meals that aren't included? And like I said, find out the meals that aren't included. Do you have a choice of the restaurants? That was the big no-no of probably everything that got my craw in Morocco was lunch was not included as part of our tour, yet all but maybe one day we were forced to eat the same meal with everybody. So there really was no freedom of choice or time. To me, all group activities should be part of the group price, the tour price. And when you have choice, that should also indicate freedom. I had mistakenly assumed that we'd be wandering around some cool town during lunchtime and be able to pick out our restaurant, but that was not the case. We would be driving, get out to eat at the pre-selected restaurant with a pre-selected meal at the pre-selected price, and then individually pay for it, which to me, like I said, if we're doing a group activity, that should be part of the tour price and should be built in accordingly. I didn't like the fact that, it was $39.95 for the tour, but then we have all these meals that we were doing as a group that we paid for separately. Again, I just thought that was a little bit misleading. I also think she was trying to keep the tour price under that $4,000 price point. I did not think that was right. If you have any special dietary requirements, can the tour company accommodate you? And look at the reviews. People are into their food. Look at the comments about the food. Did they say, oh my God, the food is fantastic? Or are there no comments about the food? Or are there bad comments about the food? Number 9, this is particularly important for adventure tours. How safety conscious is the tour company? Those of us from the U.S. and some other countries might feel, everywhere we go is always perfectly certified and all that. A lot of countries, that's not the case. So particularly if you're traveling to some countries that their safety standards may not be what you're used to, find out if the tour company holds themselves to a high standard. You want to ask if the guides are trained in first aid and carry supplies. In Nicaragua, they didn't. I was comfortable with that answer, but I made sure that I brought my own beefed up emergency kit. I'll put a link to the show on what to pack in your emergency kit also in the show notes. If you're going really deep in the wild, are the guides trained in wilderness first aid? Do they carry a satellite phone in case of an emergency if there's no cell reception? If you're going on equipment like bungee cords or zip lines, do they have to have the equipment certified or inspected? Find out. That's kind of important. And speaking of equipment, let's move to number 10, provided equipment. If there's equipment being provided, is it of good quality and condition? You certainly don't want to sleep in a ratty old sleeping bag that hadn't been cleaned, or discover while it's raining that your tent has been poorly patched. If any equipment is being provided, before you book any adventure tour, ask the company that's providing the gear about the brand's quality and condition of the equipment. How old is that key equipment, and is it being well maintained? Number 11, if this is important to you, is the tour company eco-friendly and is it supporting the local economy? What chunk of the dollars that you're spending is going to the local economy? Are they hiring local guides, doing the local homestays, shopping in the local stores, buying the food for the trips in the local stores? What is their commitment to the environment? But that's a big trend right now, so don't just pay attention. Oh, yeah, we're eco-friendly. So ask what their policy or their commitment is to the environment, and then ask for examples, because many companies, realizing that this is important to their clients, might fudge just a little bit in their generalities. And lastly, a note I waited to the very end to compare the cost of the various tour groups. And I purposely did that because if you don't select the right tour company for you, it's not going to make a bit of difference how cheap that tour was, because you're not going to enjoy it the way you should. You are going to remember forever how much fun you had or how much fun you didn't have, but you're probably not going to remember how much it cost you. I'm not saying that cost isn't important, but I am saying that cost should be way lower down the priority list of the factors that you need to consider before you buy a tour. And there's several components of cost when it comes to a group or even a self-guided tour. You need to know, and it's very important to know, what's not included. In fact, it's just as important to know what's not included as it is what is included. On the download that I'll be providing for this episode, I put together a handy little spreadsheet to help you compare the different tour companies so you can see in black and white on one piece of paper what a tour is offering or not offering, to make it easier for you to make a good, solid choice. You can also download it free by just going to the website for this episode. When you're on my website, just type in tour in the search bar, and that'll bring you right to the corresponding page for this episode. If it's unlikely that you're ever going to visit a place again, provided that you can afford it, cost should be minimized as a consideration. If the place is important enough that you're willing to spend your precious vacation time and money getting there, make sure you experience it the way that you want to. Even if it means less travel, do the trip the way that you want to do it. This doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be expensive, but you want to buy the tour that best fits all the criteria and all the vetting you've done on the above items. And I want you to pay attention, too, to a sneaky expense that you've got to consider. Pay attention to where the tour begins and ends. It can cost you more than you expect if you have to use one-way tickets, or you need to get back to your starting point in order to take advantage of a great round-trip fare. I like the free app Rome to Rio. That helps me see at a glance what my different options are for travel one way, as well as what the costs are. Google Flights is also helpful for getting an idea of fare information as well. If you carefully consider these 12 criteria before you choose a tour company for your next vacation, I'm betting you're going to have an epic time. But before we leave, I got a few final tips on choosing a tour company. Number 1, pay attention to the company's cancellation policy. If for some reason you need to cancel, or they decide to cancel like what happened to me, what's the deal? I was lucky I bought travel insurance for my trip, and I hope that you'll use my link if when you buy travel insurance, that helps support the program. I'll put a link to that in the show notes. But anyway, the travel insurance, if I wanted to use it, would have given me my money back for the 2 tours that were canceled. No, I wouldn't be any out of pocket for the fact that the tour was canceled through no fault of my own. But sometimes you might have to cancel for family reasons. Let's say something happened to my mom and I couldn't go or I had to leave right away. That's when the travel insurance would kick in for there, but the tour company's not going to give you your money back. It's tough to hooties for you on that. But often they'll have a percentage that they'll give back when you're certain days out, up to usually like 90 days or whatever. But some do, some don't. So check to see what is the cancellation policy, particularly if you're not quite sure what you're going to be able to do, or you've got some things in life that might be a possibility that could put a snafu into your travel plans. Pay attention to whether the company is fast or slow in responding to your emails or chats. And just remember, sometimes who you're talking to might be on the other side of the world in a different time zone. So give them like at least some leeway there. But if they're really slow at getting back to you, like I had some real problems with the companies I was trying to deal with in Israel, that's a red flag, figuring that maybe I should move on to a different company. You can also look to see, does the tour company offer different prices for different seasons? Particularly if you want to do something that's a little bit more expensive, going in the shoulder season might save you a significant amount of money. And for me, I usually find the weather's nicer and it's less crowded. So I actually prefer the shoulder season myself. And does the company offer last-minute deals if they have unsold slots? That's how Margaret snagged a great deal to get to Antarctica. Some tour companies have to book the permits and entrance fees long time in advance, and then if they haven't sold those, they're out of pocket on those things. So you might get a little flash sale. If so, get on their email list so you'll be aware of those if you're able to do last-minute travel. And lastly, if I've covered the destination on the Active Travel Adventures podcast, I do a free travel planning guide for every single destination. So if you go to the website, activetraveladventures.com, and use the searchable directory, put in the location that you want to go to and see what pops up. If I've done that, I've got a free download that saves you a ton of time. These travel planners are super helpful. On one page, you've got everything you need to know about the country in order to plan your trip, from the average weather to figure out when to go, the State Department safety recommendations as well as visa requirements, a currency converter, a language converter, airport information, best ways to get to and from, and other helpful hints, itinerary information, and a recommended tour company if you'd like to do something similar to what we discussed on the podcast. And so much more. And it's free. I hope you'll also join my email list, where I send out one solo email a month that includes whatever free guides or downloads I did for the previous month. And sometimes it'll have some deals or whatnot, but it just allows us to have a conversation back and forth off the podcast and via email. You don't have to write me back, but if you want to, I love getting your emails back. In fact, that's how I met Peg. That's how I met Margaret. So please, respond when you get my email. Write me back. Let me know what's going on in your life. I loved hearing from you. So I'm not just me and a microphone. And I promise I don't spam you. You can unsubscribe anytime you want. Like I said, I want this to be a two-way street. So you can always just write me at kit@activetraveladventures.com. And here's another important thing to check out before you choose a tour company. Ask them how long the company has run the tour that you're considering. If it's a new tour, there's probably going to be a couple of logistical kinks, but they can sometimes offer some value while they're working out those kinks. You may want to know who's actually running the tour. Is it being subbed out? My tour on my rafting trip was with Adventure Women, who subcontracts that with Row Adventures. I have got no problem with that. Row Adventures is a great company. So, but I like to know who's actually running the tour, because I certainly want to check them out as well. Another good question to ask your tour company is, what makes them and this tour special? And then wait and see how they answer. I hope you'll use this 12-point system the next time you're choosing a tour company, and I hope it helps you. If I've missed something that you think I should add, please let me know. I'm trying to make it exhaustive so I do not make that boo-boo again, and I want to make sure nobody else does either. I think this has been pretty comprehensive, but if I missed something, be sure to let me know. I've got a really cool trip coming up that I'm working on and training for right now. I'm going to be walking the Portuguese El Camino, and I've got less than 2 months to finish training. I'm excited about that. So if you've done that, please let me know. If you got some tips or advice on that, I'm looking forward to doing that as well. And I'm sure I'll have a show about that sometime this summer. And with that, I'll sign off. I really appreciate you listening, and I hope you'll share this program. Until next time, this is Kit Parks. Adventure on!